According to Marx, there are many things that give us a sense of what direction to take in life. What he suggests in his base and superstructure model is that these many things are made up of several different types of institutions. Those institutions constitute what he would consider the superstructure. Within those kind of institutional arrangements, there are things like religion, the state and laws, the family, education, and nobility, or the well-off. But added in a more contemporary sense, there's also the idea of business and commerce. When we're thinking about popular culture, we're thinking about this intersection, and particularly how commerce plays a role. From Marx's point of view, to understand why people actively engage in the labor that they engage in on a daily basis in order to make money, what you have to understand is the idea that most people live in the base, with the constant background of all of those superstructural elements: education, the family, commerce, religion, the state, nobility. What popular culture looks like, for many, is kind of an exit. And while we might consider ourselves as workers who are constantly in pursuit of developing wealth so that we can get out of the base and perhaps enter into the superstructure, Marx suggests what we do while we do this is ignore the conditions of our own subjugation, or put differently, the fact that these black crows represent the superstructure always looking out over us and helping us to maintain our position. When we pursue wealth by engaging in daily labor, Marx suggests what we forget is that wealth is the reason that we have to work in the first place, not for our own wealth, but for the wealth of others. We work in order to maintain society, not in order to improve our own condition. When we're at the base, we stay at the base. Very rarely can we move. And in order for us to feel comfortable where we are, and according to Marx, to forget the conditions of our own subjugation, we always have this constant belief that the money that we're working for is money that will make our lives better. In case you can't quite read the shirt, it says free time. One thing that Marx says is that as workers, the only thing that we have to give is our ability to labor, or what he calls labor power. Labor power is a concept that says that we don't really have control over much of our lives, and all we really have control over is the use of our bodies. So the shirt says free time, and what free time suggests is leisure time. And Marx says that leisure only comes about through selling our labor. Because if you think about it, if you work on a farm, farmers really rarely ever take any time off, because they're responsible for everything that goes on. They work from the crack of dawn until bedtime. And some would argue that that's terrible. But according to Marx, that's an ideal condition, because at least then you have control over your life. But in the case of labor power, all you have control over is your body and your ability to use your body in order to exchange it for a wage. When one exchanges their labor power for a wage, one needs to maintain the ability to engage in the reproduction of labor power. And therefore, free time is seen as a bonus or a benefit. The reality is, free time is better for the owners of capital, or the business in which you work, than it is for you as a worker. For you as a worker, if you don't have the ability to labor, then you have nothing to sell. So according to Marx, leisure time comes about as a way for us to feel as though we're getting something in return, when the reality is leisure time is used so that our bosses will be able to rely on us the next day. Now, at one point in time, leisure time was something that we could use freely in order to reproduce our labor. But now we start to look at leisure time as a reward, and what we often do is use our leisure time to spend money. And when we spend the money, what we get in return is stuff. What's the point of the stuff? Well, you know as well as I. The stuff is there in part in order to make us feel as though we have some reward for what we've done. And some of it's food, and some of it's clothing, and that sort of thing. But when we get rid of that, all of those elements, the stuff becomes the reason that we have to go to work in the first place. Without that stuff, we couldn't live. We need to work in order to make a wage. We use our wage in order to feed our families. We use our wage in order to get ahead in life. But the reality of it is, the wage itself allows us to participate in the superstructure. And as we participate in the superstructure, as being members of the base, what we do is we maintain and reproduce the very conditions that leave us there in the first place. Earlier I suggested that popular culture represents a sort of exit. The idea of popular culture as an exit is one that doesn't directly come from Marx, and it's important to realize that that's the case. Marx didn't really look at the notion of popular culture at all. What he looked at is the notion of the conditions of labor and how people develop a degree of consciousness about where they fit into the world. What he suggests is that people would rather not do the things they do, but they do them because they feel that they must. In more contemporary applications of Marx, which is where the later portions of the course come in, you start to think about different ways in which popular culture becomes a conduit from a Marxist position for people to engage in society by interacting with goods and ideas and people through the use of, in the case of your first assignment, your object could be considered one of those channels. There's a reason that you engage with or use the things that you use. When you use them, perhaps they are an exit from what? Well, an exit from the conditions of your own subjugation within this broad and widely defined society, often controlled by various institutional relationships. Popular culture gives us a sense that we fit in, that we belong. But popular culture at the same time, using Marx's presumption, helps us to forget where we actually fit into society. All the way at the bottom, making wealth and generating a reproduction of the conditions of the base and the superstructure. One idea of Marx's that perhaps is one of my favorite ideas of Marx's has to do with the concept of the fetishism of the commodity. This plays really well into the notion of popular culture. What the fetishism of the commodity suggests is that commodities are not material things exclusively. We tend to think of them as material things, but in so doing, we forget what they actually are, or at least why we buy them. According to Marx, objects, or the commodity, is never ever just an assembly of parts. The assembly of parts is really just a material manifestation of something else. That means that the assembly of parts, or all the little bits and pieces when put together, are an object, but the object is much more than just its material self. It's a lot more than the physical nature to an object. And indeed, we covet things not because of what they're made of materially. We tend to covet them for entirely different reasons. If you take the idea of buying a car, for example, the idea of buying a car is rarely ever about the car. How is that possible? Well, certainly we all consider some tech specs. We consider some of the materials, we consider some of the technological little bits and pieces. How big is the engine? How much gas does it use? What kind of tires are they? How much size will it take up in my driveway? That sort of thing. But the reality is, what we do is we picture ourselves in the car. We imagine what it would be like. Now for Marx, this is a clear demonstration of the fetishism of a commodity. Once we get beyond the physical technical requirements, the physical specifications, what we do is we dream. And we don't buy cars, at least not the technical requirements. What we buy is those dreams. So we empty the car of all of its bits and pieces in our minds, and we refill it or repopulate it with what he calls a fetishized vision of what it ought to be, or what it can provide. So we think of the car as a way of getting perhaps freedom. If it's a particular kind of car, it gives us status. It serves a particular purpose that's well beyond its technical specifications. This is a valuable thing to remember, because this is a really good gateway or introduction to the notion of how the popular culture functions. It's really rarely ever about the actual object itself. It's much more frequently and much more perniciously about the dreams and the ideas that we re-infuse or invest into those objects. The car is rarely ever a car. Just like almost any of the stuff you buy is rarely ever about the stuff. It's always about what you think the stuff is about, or how you imagine it, and how you imagine yourself with it. When we consider the notion of popular culture, it's then really important to think about how it is that we come to rely on these popular imaginings of things. That's when we can turn to the idea of interpolation, we can turn to the idea of psyche, or as Freud would suggest, the psychoanalytic nature of desire. Freud was very famous for the development of what you would call psychoanalytic theory. What he looked at was a very reasonable series of tensions, a series of tensions that we all have. When we think about the world, according to Freud, what we think about, sometimes consciously, most often subconsciously, is the balance between what we ought to do and what we want to do. He suggests that what we ought to do plus what we want to do tends to be a combination that produces an essential sense of our responsibilities or our responses. He suggests that desire is a fundamental motivation for human beings. We desire a way to balance our lives. We often feel as though we are being pulled between ought to and want to. Popular culture can be understood as a negotiation or as a balancing of various forms of desire. How do we really negotiate and find a balance between what we ought to do and what we want to do? Or as he described them, the id and the superego. And he suggests that balance is somewhere in the middle, what he called the ego itself. Desire, he suggests, is a fundamental motivation for almost all of human behavior. And we could understand human behavior in a way that complements the idea of desire and understanding how we behave and how we belong to things. We move on to Lacan, and Lacan has this very straightforward, although deeply complex notion of what he calls a mirror phase. In the mirror phase, Lacan suggests that when we look at things, and particularly when we desire things, what we are doing is engaging in a process of imagining ourselves with them. But according to Lacan, when we look in the mirror, it's not us that we see. It is a manifestation of a balance between what we want to and what we ought to do. The mirror phase, according to Lacan, is that notion where we start to see ourselves in opportunities. We imagine ourselves in the car, and we justify our behaviors. So I'm going to go to work to get the car Because when I look in the mirror, I can see myself in that car and what it will make me. We put up with society and rules and order in order to realize a manifestation of our desires. Moving on to some of the notions of Gramsci, what Gramsci suggests is that we live in a world that is governed by a series of relationships in a way that's very similar to Marx's notion of the base and superstructure. What Gramsci defines is what he calls a condition of hegemony. Hegemony is not the moment in which the state arrests us and calls us into its power. Instead, hegemony is a moment in which we feel as though we are surrounded by power. Power is at the center of our lives, and the further away we are from power, the less control we have over the way the world functions. And with a lack of control, what we tend to do is try to assert ourselves as best as possible. Popular culture is a way of understanding how we start to look at the reward systems that come out of desire, the things we see ourselves with. We think of them not necessarily as actively engaging in a way of forcing us into a condition, or at least forcing us into a relationship, but when we look at them more deeply, we probably could consider them that. Because according to Gramsci, the further away you are from the core, the less power you have. And the less power you have, perhaps the more restricted you are. Because power, according to Gramsci, suggests that you have a degree of autonomy, that you can make things happen and you can make things change. And instead, what we attempt to do is we try to feel as though we are as close to power as possible. And in order to do so, we consume, and we consume the right goods, we consume the right services, we participate in society in the right ways. And how do we know which ways are the right ways? Because we feel as though we can see ourselves fitting in, we can see ourselves belonging. We've been called into action, we've been interpolated, or said, hey you, come over here, this is for you. This is how you can use your power for your own purposes. Taking a closer look at Althusser, what we get to do now is identify what the notion of ideology is and how it functions. Althusser was what you would call a structuralist. As a structuralist, he looked at the notion that ideas are not just random things that people have. Ideas can be purposefully organized for a specific purpose. Now, if you think about the outcome of the base and superstructure as Althusser's underlying principle, what he suggests is that the organized system of beliefs or ideas that govern our society tend to be organized for the purpose of reproducing society as it is. Now, one of the greatest things about Althusser's suggestion, and not only his suggestions, but his coining of the concept of ideology in the first place, is that ideology is something that we could understand as a reason for doing the things that we do. Because we do what we do because we believe them to be the right thing to do. So we engage in this organized system of beliefs, or ideology, because the beliefs that we follow are seen to be able to produce what we think of as the right course of action, or the right way in which to engage in the world. Now, the funny thing about ideology is that we don't have to agree with the organized system of beliefs. All we have to do is acknowledge it, recognize it, and if we perform within its constraints, we reproduce it. We don't have to be asked to reproduce it. Just by following the rules, in this case, let's say your family says to you, you have to go to school in order to get an education. And why do you need to get an education? Well, because if you don't get an education, you'll never get a good job. And why do you need to get a good job? In order for you to make money. And why do you need to make money? So that you can participate in society. You don't want to be on the outside of society, of course. You don't want to give up your power. You don't want to live outside of the law. So we engage in these organized systems of belief in order to maintain, or at least to assert, our possible contributions to the world, or at least the world as we understand it to be within this organized system of beliefs. Now, once we do that, we necessarily reproduce that system of beliefs. Don't have to agree with it, but just by engaging in it, we reproduce it.